after capital had taken centuries in extending the working day to its normal maximum limit, and then beyond this to the limit of the natural day of hours, there followed on the birth of machinism and modern industry in the last third of the 8th century, a violent encroachment like that of an avalanche in its intensity and extent. All bounds of morals and nature, age and sex, day and night were broken down. Even the ideas of day and night, of rustic simplicity in the old statutes, became so confused that an English judge as late as needed a quite Talmudic sagacity to explain judicially what was day and what was night. Capital celebrated its orgy. As soon as the working class, stunned at first by the noise and turmoil of the new system of production, recovered, in some measure, its senses, its resistance began, and first in the native land of machinism in England. For years, however, the concessions conquered by the workpeople were purely nominal. Parliament passed labor laws between end, but was shrewd enough not to vote a penny for their carrying out, for the requisite officials, and they remained a dead letter. The fact is that prior to the act of young persons and children were worked all night, all day, or both ad libitum. A normal working day for modern industry only dates from the Factory Act of, which included cotton, wool, flax, and silk factories. Nothing is more characteristic of the spirit of capital than the history of the English Factory Acts from 2. The Act of declares the ordinary factory working day to be from 5:30 in the morning to 8:30 in the evening, and within these limits, a period of hours, it is lawful to employ young persons, at any time of the day, provided no one individual young person should work more than hours in any one day, except in certain cases especially provided for. The H section of the Act provided that there shall be allowed in the course of every day not less than 1½ hours for meals to every such person restricted as hereinbefore provided. The employment of children under, with exceptions mentioned later, was forbidden. The work of children between and was limited to hours a day. Night work, according to this act, work between, and was forbidden for all persons between. The lawmakers were so far from wishing to trench on the freedom of capital to exploit adult labor power, or, as they called it, the freedom of labor, that they created a special system in order to prevent the factory acts from having a consequence so outrageous. The great evil of the factory system as at present conducted, says the first report of the Central Board of the Commission of June H., has appeared to us to be that it entails the necessity of continuing the labor of children to the utmost length of that of the adults. The only remedy for this evil, short of the limitation of the labor of adults which would, in our opinion, create an evil greater than that which is sought to be remedied, appears to be the plan of working double sets of children. Under the name of system of relays, this plan was therefore carried out so that from until the afternoon, one set of children between and from 2 in the evening another set were put to, and legislation is necessary for the prevention of death, in any form in which it can be prematurely inflicted, and certainly this must be viewed as a most cruel mode of inflicting it. That same reformed Parliament, which in its delicate consideration for the manufacturers, condemned children under, for years to come, to hours of work per week in the factory hell, on the other hand, in the Emancipation Act, which also administered freedom drop by drop, forbade the planters from the outset to work any Negro slave more than hours a week. But in no wise conciliated, capital now began a noisy agitation that went on for several years. It turned chiefly on the age of those who, under the name of children, were limited to hours' work, and were subject to a certain amount of compulsory education. According to capitalistic anthropology, the age of childhood ended at, or at the outside at. The more nearly the time approached for the coming into full force of the Factory Act, the fatal year, the more wildly raged the mob of manufacturers. They managed, in fact, to intimidate the government to such an extent that, it proposed to lower the limit of the age of childhood from 2. In the meantime, the pressure from without grew more threatening. Courage failed the House of Commons. It refused to throw children under the juggernaut car of capital for more than hours a day, and the act came into full operation. It remained unaltered until June. No instances have come to my knowledge of adult women having expressed any regret at their rights being thus far interfered with. The working time of children under was reduced to half, and in certain circumstances to hours a day. To get rid of the abuses of the spurious relay system, the law established besides others the following important regulations: that the hours of work of children and young persons shall be reckoned from the time when any child or young person shall begin to work in the morning. 1 hour thereof at the least shall be given before 3 of the clock in the afternoon, and at the same period of the day. No child or young person shall be employed more than 5 hours before without an interval for meal time of at least minutes. No child or young person shall be employed or allowed to remain in any room in which any manufacturing process is then carried on. And it has been seen that these minutiae, which, with military uniformity, regulate by stroke of the clock the times, limits, pauses of the work were not at all the products of parliamentary fancy. They developed gradually out of circumstances, as natural laws of the modern mode of production. Their formulation, official recognition, and proclamation by the state were the result of a long struggle of classes. One of their first consequences was that, in practice, the working day of the adult males in factories became subject to the same limitations, since in most processes of production the cooperation of the children, young persons, and women is indispensable. On the whole, therefore, during the period from 2, the hours working day became general and uniform in all branches of industry under the Factory Act. The manufacturers, however, did not allow this progress without a compensating retrogression. At their instigation, the House of Commons reduced the minimum age for exploitable children from 2, in order to assure that additional supply of factory children which is due to capitalists, according to divine and human law. The years are epoch-making in the economic history of England. The repeal of the Corn Laws and of the duties on cotton and other raw material, free trade proclaimed as the guiding star of legislation, in a word, the arrival of the millennium. On the other hand, in the same years, the Chartist movement and the hours agitation reached their highest point. They found allies in the Tories panting for revenge. Despite the fanatical opposition of the army of perjured free traders, with Bright and Cobden at their head, the 10 Hours Bill, struggled for so long, went through Parliament. The new Factory Act of June H. enacted that on July T. there should be a preliminary shortening of the working day for young persons and all females to hours, but that on May T. there should be a definite limitation of the working day to hours. In other respects, the Act only amended and completed the acts of N. Kapital now entered upon a preliminary campaign in order to hinder the Act from coming into full force on May T. And the workers themselves, under the presence that they had been taught by experience, were to help in the destruction of their own work. The moment was cleverly chosen. It must be remembered, too, that there has been more than 2 years of great suffering among the factory operatives, from many mills having worked short time, and many being altogether closed. Considerable number of the operatives must therefore be in very narrow circumstances, many, it is to be feared, in debt, so that it might fairly have been presumed that at the present time they would prefer working the longer time, in order to make up for past losses, perhaps to pay off debts, or get their furniture out of pawn, or replace that sold, or to get a new supply of clothes for themselves and their family. The manufacturers tried to aggravate the natural effect of these circumstances by a general reduction of wages by %. This was done, so to say, to celebrate the inauguration of the new free trade era. Then followed a further reduction of divided by % as soon as the working day was shortened to, and a reduction of double that amount as soon as it was finally shortened to hour. Wherever, therefore, circumstances allowed it, a reduction of wages of at least % took place. Under such favorably prepared conditions, the agitation among the factory workers for the repeal of the Act was begun. Neither lies, bribery, nor threats were spared in this attempt. But all was in vain. Concerning the half-dozen petitions in which workpeople were made to complain of their oppression by the Act, the petitioners themselves declared under oral examination that their signatures had been extorted from them. They felt themselves oppressed, but not exactly by the Factory Act. But if the manufacturers did not succeed in making the workpeople speak as they wished, they themselves shrieked all the louder in press and Parliament in the name of the workpeople. They denounced the factory inspectors as a kind of revolutionary commissioners like those of the French National Convention, ruthlessly sacrificing the unhappy factory workers to their humanitarian crotchet. This maneuver also failed. Factory Inspector Leonard Horner conducted in his own person, and through his sub-inspectors, many examinations of witnesses in the factories of Lancashire. About % of the workpeople examined declared in favor of hours, a much smaller percentage in favor of, and an altogether insignificant minority for the old hours. They would much prefer working 10 hours for less wages, but that they had no choice, that so many were out of employment, that if they refused to work the longer time, others would immediately get their places, so that it was a question with them of agreeing to work the longer time, or of being thrown out of employment altogether. understand that which follows we must remember that the factory acts of, and were all three in force so far as the one did not amend the other, that not one of these limited the working day of the male worker over, and that since the hours from 2 had remained the legal day, within the limits of which at first and later the hours labor of young persons and women had to be performed under the prescribed condition. The manufacturers began by here and there discharging a part of, in many cases half of the young persons and women employed by them, and then, for the adult males, restoring the almost obsolete night work. The 10 Hours Act, they cried, leaves no other alternative. Their second step dealt with the legal pauses for meal. Let us hear the factory inspectors. Since the restriction of the hours of work to 10, the factory occupiers maintain, although they have not yet practically gone the whole length, that supposing the hours of work to be from 2 they fulfill the provisions of the statutes by allowing an hour before and half an hour after. In some cases they now allow an hour, or half an hour for dinner, insisting at the same time that they are not bound to allow any part of the hour and a half in the course of the factory working day. The manufacturers maintain therefore that the scrupulously strict provisions of the Act with regard to meal times only gave the operatives permission to eat and drink before coming into, and after leaving the factory, at home. And why should not the workpeople eat their dinner before in the morning? The Crown lawyers, however, decided that the prescribed meal times must be in the interval during the working hours, and that it will not be lawful to work for hours continuously, from 2, without any interval. After these pleasant demonstrations, Kapital preluded its revolt by a step which agreed with the letter of the law and was therefore legal. The Act of certainly prohibited the employment after of such children from 2, as had been employed before noon. But it did not regulate in any way the half hour's work of the children, whose work time began at midday or later. Children of might, if they began work at noon, be employed from 2 hour, from 2 in the afternoon hours from 2. In the evening, a half hours in all, the legal a half hours. Or better still, in order to make their work coincide with that of the adult male laborers up to. The manufacturers only had to give them no work till in the afternoon. They could then keep them in the factory without intermission till in the evening. And it is now expressly admitted that the practice exists in England from the desire of mill owners to have their machinery at work for more than hours a day, to keep the children at work with male adults after all the young persons and women have left, and until, if the factory owners choose. Workmen and factory inspectors protested on hygienic and moral grounds, but Kapital answered, "My deeds upon my head. I crave the law, the penalty and forfeit of my bond." In fact, according to statistics laid before the House of Commons on July 8, in spite of all protests on July 8, children were subjected to this practice in factory. Still, this was not enough. The lynx eye of Kapital discovered that the Act did not allow hours work before midday without a pause of at least minutes for refreshment, but prescribed nothing of the kind for work after midday. Therefore, it claimed and obtained the enjoyment not only of making children of drudge without intermission from 2, but also of making them hunger during that time. His breast. So says the bond. This was the only possible plan by which to maintain, under the 10 Hours Act, the industrial supremacy of Great Britain. Perhaps it may be a little difficult to detect irregularities under the relay system, but what of that? Is the great manufacturing interest of this country to be treated as a secondary matter in order to save some little trouble to inspectors and sub-inspectors of factory? All these shifts naturally were of no avail. The factory inspectors appealed to the law courts. But soon such a cloud of dust in the way of petitions from the masters overwhelmed the Home Secretary, Sir George Grey, that in a circular of August H, he recommends the inspectors not to lay informations against mill owners for a breach of the letter of the Act, or for employment of young persons by relays in cases in which there is no reason to believe that such young persons have been actually employed for a longer period than that sanctioned by law. Hereupon, Factory Inspector J. Stewart allowed the so-called relay system during the hours of the factory day throughout Scotland, where it soon flourished again as of old. The English factory inspectors, on the other hand, declared that the Home Secretary had no power dictatorially to suspend the law, and continued their legal proceedings against the pro-slavery rebellion. But what was the good of summoning the capitalists when the courts, in this case the country magistrates, Cobbets, great unpaid, acquitted them? In these tribunals, the masters sat in judgment on themselves an example. One Eskrig, cotton spinner of the firm of Kershaw, Lease & Co., had laid before the factory inspector of his district the scheme of a relay system intended for his mill. Receiving a refusal, he at first kept quiet. A few months later, an individual named Robinson, also a cotton spinner, and if not his man Friday, at all events related to Eskrig, appeared before the borough magistrates of Stockport on a charge of introducing the identical plan of relays invented by Eskrig. 4 justices sat, among them 3 cotton spinners, at their head this same inevitable Eskrig. Eskrig acquitted Robinson, and now was of opinion that what was right for Robinson was fair for Eskrig. Supported by his own legal decision, he introduced the system at once into his own factory. Of course, the composition of this tribunal was in itself a violation of the law. These judicial farces, exclaims Inspector Howell, urgently call for a remedy, either that the law should be so altered as to be made to conform to these decisions, or that it should be administered by a less fallible tribunal, whose decisions would conform to the law when these cases are brought forward. I long for a stipendiary magistrate. Crown lawyers declared the master's interpretation of the act of absurd. But the saviors of society would not allow themselves to be turned from their purpose. Leonard Horner reports, already in December, Leonard Horner had a list of manufacturers and overlookers who unanimously declared that no system of supervision could, under this relay system, prevent enormous overwork. Now the same children and young persons were shifted from the spinning room to the weaving room, now, during hours, from one factory to another. How was it possible to control a system which, under the guise of relays, is some one of the many plans for shuffling the hands about an endless variety and shifting the hours of work and of rest for different individuals throughout the day, so that you may never have one complete set of hands working together in the same room at the same time? But on this apparently decisive victory of capital followed at once a revulsion. The workpeople had hitherto offered a passive, although inflexible and unremitting resistance. They now protested in Lancashire and Yorkshire in threatening meeting. The pretended 10 Hours Act was thus simple humbug. Parliamentary cheating had never existed. The factory inspectors urgently warned the government that the antagonism of classes had arrived at an incredible tension. Some of the masters themselves murmured, on account of the contradictory decisions of the magistrates, a condition of things altogether abnormal and anarchical obtained. One law holds in Yorkshire, another in Lancashire, one law in one parish of Lancashire, another in its immediate neighborhood. The manufacturer in large towns could evade the law. The manufacturer in country districts could not find the people necessary for the relay system, still less for the shifting of hands from one factory to another. And the first birthright of capital is equal exploitation of labor power by all capitalists. The delicate texture of the fabric in which they were employed, requiring a lightness of touch, only to be acquired by their early introduction to these factories. The children were slaughtered out and out for the sake of their delicate fingers, as in southern Russia the horned cattle for the sake of their hide and tallow. At length the privilege granted was limited to the departments of silk twisting and silk winding. But here, to make amends to capital bereft of its freedom, the work time for children was raised from 2½ hours. Pretext: labor in silk mills was lighter than in mills for other fabrics, and less likely in other respects also to be prejudicial to health. Official medical inquiries proved afterwards that, on the contrary, the average death rate is exceedingly high in the silk districts, and amongst the female part of the population is higher even than it is in the cotton districts of Lancashire. Despite the protests of the factory inspector, renewed every month, the mischief continues to this hour. Factory legislation for the first time went beyond its original sphere in the Printworks Act of. The displeasure with which capital received this new extravagance speaks through every line of the act. It limits the working day for children from 2, and for women to hours between and without any legal pause for meal times. It allows males over to be worked at will day and night. It is a parliamentary abortion. The dye works and bleach works all came under the Factory Act of lace and stocking manufactures In consequence of the first report of the Commission on the Employment of Children, the same fate was shared by the manufacturers of all earthenwares, lucifer matches, percussion caps, cartridges, carpets, fustian cutting, and many processes included under the name of finishing. In the year, bleaching in the open air and baking were placed under special acts, by which, in the former, the labor of young persons and women during the night time, and in the latter, the employment of journeymen bakers between in the evening and in the morning were forbidden. We shall return to the later proposals of the same commission, which threatened to deprive of their freedom all the important branches of English industry, with the exception of agriculture, mines, and the means of transport. First, the passion of capital for an unlimited and reckless extension of the working day is first gratified in the industries earliest revolutionized by water power, steam, and machinery, in those first creations of the modern mode of production: cotton, wool, flax, and silk spinning and weaving. The changes in the material mode of production and the corresponding changes in the social relations of the producers gave rise first to an extravagance beyond all bounds, and then in opposition to this, called forth a control on the part of society which legally limits, regulates, and makes uniform the working day and its pauses. This control appears, therefore, during the first half of the 19th century simply as exceptional legislation. As soon as this primitive dominion of the new mode of production was conquered, it was found that, in the meantime, not only had many other branches of production been made to adopt the same factory system, but that manufactures with more or less obsolete methods, such as potteries, glassmaking, and that old-fashioned handicrafts like baking, and finally, even that the so-called domestic industries, such as nail-making, had long since fallen as completely under capitalist exploitation as the factories themselves. Legislation was, therefore, compelled to gradually get rid of its exceptional character, or where, as in England, it proceeds after the manner of the Roman casuists, to declare any house in which work was done to be a factory. France limps slowly behind England. The February Revolution was necessary to bring into the world the hours law, which is much more deficient than its English original. For all that, the French revolutionary method has its special advantages. It once for all commands the same limit to the working day in all shops and factories without distinction, whilst English legislation reluctantly yields to the pressure of circumstances, now on this point, now on that, and is getting lost in a hopelessly bewildering tangle of contradictory enactments. On the other hand, the French law proclaims as a principle that which in England was only one in the name of children, minors, and women, and has been only recently for the first time claimed as a general right. In the United States of North America, every independent movement of the workers was paralyzed so long as slavery disfigured a part of the republic. Labor cannot emancipate itself in the white skin, or in the black it is branded. But out of the death of slavery, a new life at once arose. The first fruit of the Civil War was the 8 hours agitation, that ran with the 7-leagued boots of the locomotive from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from New England to California. The General Congress of Labor at Baltimore declared, the first and great necessity of the present, to free the labor of this country from capitalistic slavery, is the passing of a law by which 8 hours shall be the normal working day in all states of the American Union. We are resolved to put forth all our strength until this glorious result is attained. At the same time, the Congress of the International Working Men's Association at Geneva, on the proposition of the London General Council, resolved that the limitation of the working day is a preliminary condition without which all further attempts at improvement and emancipation must prove abortive. The Congress proposes 8 hours as the legal limit of the working day. Thus the movement of the working class on both sides of the Atlantic, that had grown instinctively out of the conditions of production themselves, endorsed the words of the English factory inspector, R.J. Saunders: further steps towards a reformation of society can never be carried out with any hope of success, unless the hours of labor be limited, and the prescribed limit strictly enforced.